Hey guys, welcome to chapter 18, video 4b. Remember, you said I was going to break up the section of Napoleon into two different videos. So we left off talking about his empire, about how he had built this huge empire and either directly or indirectly was now in control of most of the continent of Europe. Great Britain was outside of his control, tried to hurt them with the continental system, didn't do too well. But Britain wasn't going to be the only problem that Napoleon faced. There were a number of other challenges. And ironically, one of the major things that led to French victory also led to French defeat. And I'm talking here about nationalism. Now, nationalism we know is pride in your country. And we discussed in the previous video how Revolutionary War spread nationalism throughout France. And especially when Napoleon comes to power, the people are going to be very proud of the fact that they're now the most powerful country in Europe. That just makes sense. Nationalism, it also worked against Napoleon, though. You see, it inspired nationalism among the conquered nations to drive out the French. Perfect example of this, Spain. Spanish resistance was particularly strong. The Spanish hated the fact that Napoleon put his brother on the throne. Now, you have this famous painting here of Spanish rebels being executed by French soldiers. It was meant as a propaganda piece among the Spanish to try and rile them up to help drive out the French. And as efforts to drive out the French intensified, it inspired other nations to resist Napoleon's rule. Even when dealing with these uprisings, Napoleon was still in firm control because he had a huge army, though. All that changed with his disastrous invasion of Russia. The Emperor of Russia and Napoleon were once allies, but this stopped once Russia ceased to support Napoleon after the continental system failed. So in 1812, in 1812, Napoleon assembled his Grand Army, over 600,000 troops from 20 different nations, and they marched across Eastern Europe and they invaded Russia. And the Russians practiced this thing called scorched earth strategy. Meaning as they retreated from Napoleon's army, they burned crops, villages, and supplies. Now, yes, why would they burn their own stuff? The reason is because Russia was planning long term, right? They were thinking the long game here. They wanted to leave the French with no supplies as the real weapon they had against the French was coming up, and that was the winter. Napoleon had reached Moscow by September, but as the Russian winter set in, he realized he didn't have enough supplies to survive. So he ordered his army to return and started a 1,000-mile trek back. Russians used sneak attacks and just let the cold do its job, and this led to huge losses. Of the 600,000 that set out, less than 20,000 returned. So even though Napoleon still sat on the throne, his image of invincibility had been shattered. Remember this picture that we looked at in class of the majestic Napoleon leading his troops to victory up the hill, right? Kind of very heroic, dashing figure. Contrast that, let me move myself out of the way here, with this one of Napoleon leading his troops back. And you can see just, it looks like something out of The Walking Dead, right? Or kind of, in Game of Thrones, right? Where they're walking through the winter and just they're beaten down. Napoleon himself, all right, on his horse. Just even the horse, right? He's riding this magnificent war steed up top, and now this is this, harried old nag that he's riding. He's hoveled over. He's defeated. He's not leading them to any victory anymore. Napoleon's image of this kind of undefeatable figure, it was done. So even though he sat on the throne, his reputation was ruined now. And this is going to lead to his fall from power. Moving back over. So his defeat in Russia, it strengthened the resolve of his enemies, and they formed an alliance to take him out of power. It was Russia, Britain, Austria, and Prussia. They combined to defeat Napoleon in 1813, and in 1814, he eventually abdicated power. He was exiled to the island of Elba, a little island in the Atlantic, and Louis XVI's brother was now made the new king. The restoration of the monarchy didn't go too well, though. A lot of emigres, remember those nobles and priests that left during the revolution, they returned to France and they tried to bring back the old order, which understandably upset the peasants in the lower class. France's economy started to tank with all of the chaos and overturn, and many of the peasants wanted Napoleon back. This led to his return to power in 1815, and he returned really kind of as a conquering hero. The new king, hearing that Napoleon was coming in, he fled Paris, and the people cheered Napoleon as he returned. For the moment, it looked like the great French Empire would return. Didn't last long, though. Napoleon was crushed at the Battle of Waterloo the following year. It was really only 100 days since his return. British and Prussian forces, they defeated him near the town of Waterloo in Belgium, and after this, Napoleon was forced to abdicate again. He went into exile in a small island in the Atlantic off the coast of Africa called St. Helena, and this time he would never return. He died while in exile. Now, when learning about Napoleon, it's important to analyze his legacy. At the height of his power, Napoleon was one of, if not the most powerful men in the world. He was certainly the most powerful man in Europe. And there's a lot of debate, though, as to how his legacy should be viewed, especially within the subject of the revolution. Did he help, continue and progress revolutionary ideas, or was he a huge step back? Regardless, it's clear that he made a huge impact, though. He spread the idea of nationalism across Europe, both directly and indirectly, like we just described. The Napoleonic Code became a legal standard in the Western world. Wasn't great for everybody, particularly women, but still, it created a strong standard. He also ended the Holy Roman Empire. This would eventually help in the creation of Germany. When the French Revolution started in 1789, this all through here is what eventually become Germany would look like. It was kind of a patchwork of a bunch of different German states. Prussia, this one over here, was the most powerful, but there was no German nation, right? There was no country called Germany at the time. It goes back to the Middle Ages with the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon dissolved all this. He created what he called the Confederation of the Rhine. And even that wasn't a unified country, but still it set the stage for the creation of a unified country later in the 1800s. And we'll talk more about that in later chapters. Plus, he also helped with the expansion of the U.S. with his decision to sell the Louisiana Purchase. It doubled the size of the new country, right? You see the Louisiana Purchase. Here's the original U.S. Let me just erase this so you can see it clearly. There we go. All right. Napoleon was desperate for cash with his wars, so he sold this to the new country, and overnight, the U.S. was doubled. So that had a huge impact for it. So by 1815, Napoleon was gone, and the rest of Europe had to figure out what to do next. They figured this out at a meeting called the Congress of Vienna. This was a meeting of all the great powers of Europe. You had Great Britain, you had Austria, you had Prussia, Russia, etc. It was held in the capital of the Austrian Empire, Vienna, and its main goal was to achieve a lasting peace after all the craziness of the 1700s. They decided they were going to do this by creating a balance of power, as well as protecting monarchies, right? They wanted to bring back the old monarchies because they felt, even though peasants may not be particularly happy with it, it kept things stable. So this was a more conservative movement to bring back the old ways. They restored hereditary monarchs like Louis the 18th, who was brother of the executed king, and many leaders wanted to bring back things back to the way they were before the revolution began. They also redrew the map of Europe. Okay, so this is what Europe was looking like in 1815. You see a couple of new countries in there. Right? You see the Kingdom of the Netherlands and you see Belgium. They were created out of French territory, your German Confederation. Still no unified Germany, but that would be in the way. And you notice how France's boundaries were shrunk fairly significantly. You also notice that there's no unified Italy yet either. Italy and Germany would be formed in a couple of decades after this. But still, you got Russia, you got the Austrian Empire, you got a monarchy back in France, you've got monarchy in England. The old ways were still making a comeback. Major alliances were made at this time in order to maintain this new balance of power. And they set up a system called the Concert of Europe. This was an agreement in which representatives from the European nations would meet periodically to discuss any problems that could damage the peace. And this new system succeeded in creating a peace for 100 years. Europe wouldn't see another large-scale war until World War I in 1914. But nationalism would have a major impact in creating new countries and kicking some established governments out of power. But we'll talk about that in later chapters.